Welcome to the Rap Soul Podcast, where we dive deep into the world of music that moves our hearts and gets our feet tapping. This is the intersection of rap and soul music from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. We appreciate you for listening. Share this podcast with a friend or family member who loves music as much as you do. The podcast is hosted by 12 Kyle. Next up, the Rap Soul Podcast.
Welcome to an edition of the Rap Soul Podcast. I am your host, 12 Kyle. And again, this is the Rap Soul Podcast. Let me first start by thanking you for finding this podcast. If you came here from the 12 Kyle podcast, thank you. If you came here from social media, thank you. If you just randomly found this podcast, thank you. The Rap Soul Podcast is a new venture that I have. What I'd like to say is that the Rap Soul Podcast is the intersection of rap, soul, hip hop, R&B from the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s. You may ask what the Rap Soul Podcast is. It's a compelling show that blends both the worlds of rap and soul music. What we like to do is we like to offer listeners a deep dive into this interaction. It's hosted by me, 12 Kyle. And what we do is we explore the rich history of influential artists, the music, and evolving trends with rap and soul music. Each episode will feature different discussions, whether it be tracks, specific albums, artist review, things of that nature, and just exploration of the emotions of the culture at a specific amount of time. What I'll do is I'll share my personal insights and behind the scenes stories and, my expert opinion, if you will. So you'll get a informative based podcast. And this was solely for rap fans and soul fans and R&B fans and hip hop fans. I think, let me scratch that. I know this is a great listen for anyone interested in understanding the profound similarities and relationships between rap music and soul music in a specific time capsule. So welcome. Again, welcome. Now, on this episode, what we're going to talk about is albums that were quote unquote almost classic. If you're familiar with the Source magazine, it was a very popularized magazine in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s that was, quote unquote, the hip hop Bible, if you will. And in the back of the Source magazine, of each magazine that they would put out, there would be a ranking where they would preview an album that was about to come out, and they had a mic system. And before I even get into that, let me show you what an actual Source magazine looks like. Look at this one right here. For those of you watching on YouTube, thank you for watching. The cover is Sean Corey Carter, Jay-Z. But yeah, this is what a Source magazine looked like. And if you can actually get your hands on one, you'll find them to be very interesting. Some of the articles, and this is pretty thick. It's 225 pages. So the thing about the Source magazine was, when I read the Source magazine, not only was I interested in the articles, but even strumming through this one, I realized how many advertisements there were for other music and other products that were used in hip hop. But that being said, at the back of the magazine was their mic system, and this is where they would review an album and rank it based on the mics. And this is how the mics work. If you got one mic, that meant that the album was totally whack. For the record, I don't think I've ever read a Source magazine where somebody got one mic. If you got two mics, that means you needed help, doesn't stand out. That's the criteria for that. If you got three mics meant that it was good, worth checking out. And this is a way that, us fans would later adapt to how we would consume our music. If you got four mics, it would be deemed that the album was slamming, definite satisfaction. And if you got five mics, that meant that you got a hip hop classic. So just so that you know, there's about 14 or 15 albums that were deemed at the time that they were first reviewed by the Source magazine as hip hop classics. I did an episode on that on the 12 Kyle podcast. We may come back and revisit that conversation on this podcast. But for this discussion, what I wanted to talk about was the albums that got 4.5 mics. So they weren't 4 mics, but they weren't 5 mics. So you're in between. And these were the albums that were originally given 4.5 mics. Now, what I did was I added some additional layers to it, if you will. What I wanted to do was add a certain criteria. Because I think here's the thing that a lot of us hip hop fans, R&B fans, soul fans, rap fans do. We base what we listen to based on how we like it. And so, like, I hear the word classic get thrown around a lot on social media. And the reality is, for a lot of people, the classic albums are the albums that they really, really like. It's not necessarily because the albums are superiorly dope to everything else that's out or had been out at that particular time. So there's a level of bias there, right? So I'm trying to remove the bias, but we all have our biases on the albums that we like and we don't like. And that doesn't matter if it's rap or soul. But what I wanted to do was add some criteria as I examine these albums that got 4.5 mics, because that's what this episode is about. We're going to take a look at these albums that were deemed almost classic. And what I want to know from you is, as you listen, are these albums almost classic or are they classic? Because maybe for some, you can make a case that they shouldn't have gotten 4.5 mic. They really should have gotten 5. And I'll be honest, especially for those of you who weren't around when the Source magazine was in its prime in the early 90s, if you got 5 mics on an album, that meant a lot. That meant your album was, again, a certified hip hop classic. It means that the album is flawless, damn near perfect, if you will. Or maybe some people would say it was perfect. That being said, there were albums that got 5 mics. Again, we're not going to talk about them on this particular episode, but I wanted to examine the ones that got 4.5 mics. And we're going to take a look and see if they really, truly are almost classic. So let me tell you about the criteria that I added. It's 4 things. 1, coherence. Now, coherent means like the flow of the album. Does it flow? Does it sound a certain way? Can you understand what is being said and what is going on? For example, I'll use Das Effects as an example. While Das Effects was a really, truly very good hip hop group, I didn't understand most of the stuff that they said. But that didn't take away from the fact that they were dope and that they put out dope albums. I just didn't understand it. So I think that plays into your coherence. So that's one criteria. Criteria number 2, and they're in no particular order. The replayability. How much can you replay on this album? Can you go back after the album comes out and still listen to it in that particular time frame? I'm not talking about now, because the way we listen and the way that we consume music now is totally different, right? So the replayability back then. So if the album came out in 1992, how much was you going back and listening to this particular album, playing it over and over and over again, learning the words, because we didn't have the internet, right? Number 3, the lyrics. Obviously, lyrics matter. I don't ever want to hear a hip hop fan say that lyrics don't matter, because lyrics do matter. At least to me, they do. And I would think that they would matter to most hip hop fans. So the lyrics. And category number 4, the production. How is it produced? How does it sound? How does the album sound and fit sonically? So those are the criteria that we used. I wanted to make sure that I preface this episode by saying that, because I think a lot of times people will look at a list and then they base it off of what they like. And I'll be honest, I do the same thing too from time to time. But on this one, because I'm going to give you specific albums that we already know got 4.5 mics, what I want to be able to do is explain how and why I think they should either keep those 4.5 mics, maybe bump down to 4 mics, or maybe bump up to 5 mics. So with that being said, let's get started. All right. So the first album, and again, these are in no particular order. We're going to go with this album did get 4.5 mics in the source. 1991 from the group The Main Source. The album was entitled Breaking Atoms. This album is a really good album. The album is a very, very solid album. I want to say a lot of people were surprised at the 4.5. But let me just look over some of the tracks. Now, some of the tracks that stand out, Just Hanging Out, looking at the front door, Just a Friendly Game of Baseball, Watch Roger Do His Thing, Live at the Barbecue. We'll come back to that in just a second. This album got 4.5 mics. I think if you look at the coherence, the replayability, the lyrics, and the production, you can make a case that that is a solid review. I mean, like, there's no if, ands, or buts in between. The aforementioned Live at the Barbecue, at least for me, was my introduction to Nas, because Nas came on and rapped on this particular song. And this song is a standout song in hip hop because it birthed Nas to a lot of us, right? That being said, having that song on this album definitely helps. It's a feature, so it's not just main shows, because it was Joe Fatale, Akinele, and Nas on that track. But, you know, personally, I think when you have a lot of guest features, that takes away from the overall coherence of the album, because, listen, I came to the album to hear you. I didn't come to hear everybody else. Now, if you're dealing with a crew like Wu-Tang, that's a little bit different story. We'll get to that in just a few. But that being said, I think this is a 4.5 mic album. It's not one of the greatest albums of all time, but it is a very, very super dope album, especially for 1991. There were no albums that sounded like this. So I have no argument with this album being 4.5 mics. Next up, The Death Certificate by Ice Cube. This album was released in 1991 as well. Listen, before I start talking about this album, I gotta admit, I am extremely biased when it comes to Ice Cube. That's one of my favorite MCs. This is an incredible album. I remove my biases aside to, look at this album. This album had 2 killer sides, and the album runs right at 61 minutes. So it's an hour and a minute long. Man, listen, from My Summer Vacation to Steady Mobbing on side A, to side B, I Want to Kill Sam, Horny Little Devil, True to the Game, No Vaseline, which in my opinion is the greatest diss song ever. This album got 4.5 mics. I will agree. This is a 4.5 mic album. I will also say that there are some who think that this is a 5 mic album. I probably could understand. I don't necessarily know that I would give it 5 mics because it is an hour long. And I mean, even back then in 1991, an hour is a long time. There's a couple of tracks I think you could probably get rid of. Colorblind, Bird in the Hand on side A. But and that's just me being picky. And I am very picky at times. That being said, listen, if you told me it was a 5 mic album, I'm not gonna argue with you. If you told me Breaking Atoms was a 5 mic album, you'd get some gripe from me because I don't think it's one of the greatest albums of all time. And that's the thing. Like, you have to say, if it's a 5 mic album, it is considered to be one of the greatest albums of all time in hip hop. And Ice Cube, Death Certificate, I don't think so. And again, that's with my bias. I just don't think so. You won't get an argument from me, but I don't think so. Let's see. The next album. 1992, The Chronic from Dr. Dre. Listen, this album is a lot of things. This album was groundbreaking. This album was violent. This album was prophetic. This album was misogynistic. It was homophobic. It was a lot of things. But at the end of the day, this is a cold ass album from start to finish. Listen, you could make a case, and there's been a case made that this has been the best West Coast album. I don't agree with that, but you could make a case that it is, right? The tracks from Dre Day to Let Me Ride, my personal favorite song on this album, Nothing But a G Thing, Lyrical Gangbang. The Doctor's Office skit definitely doesn't need to be on it. Sidebar, I don't know why we let artists get that off back in the 90s. There were a lot of sex-induced skits on some of these albums, and it really, listening to it now 20, 30 years later, it does not fit at all. But Stranded on Death Row and the track Closer, Bitches Ain't Shit. I mean, listen, this one's tough, man. This one's tough, but I don't think that. Okay, it's a 4.5 mic album. I will agree, it's 4.5 mics. I can't give it 5. I don't think that there's anything that they didn't reinvent the wheel here, right? And again, it's Dr. Dre's album, but technically it's a compilation album because Dre ain't that kind of rapper. We already know that, right? But for Dr. Dre to have this land where it landed was crazy. Because here's the thing you got to remember. In 1992, Dr. Dre has left NWA, right? He's left NWA. He's teamed up with this guy named Suge Knight, who we didn't know. At least I didn't know. Never heard of the guy before at the time. And so, back then, if you left a group, it was over for you. Like, nobody thought that Dr. Dre was going to survive without NWA. And he created this masterpiece. And this started arguably the great run of the West for not just Dr. Dre, but Death Row Records as well. So, yeah, if you say it's a 5 mic album, I really don't have a comeback for it. I don't think that it is, though. Again, I don't think that they reinvented the wheel. And I think ultimately it's a compilation album. It's not a Dr. Dre, I'm going to rap for 18 tracks album, because that's not who Dr. Dre is, right? So in that sense, I knock it down a peg. So it's a 4.5 mic album. If you think that it's a 5, please let me know. I don't think that it is. But that doesn't mean it's not a badass album. Oh my gosh, this album is so cold. Next up, again, these are in no particular order. Enter the Wu-Tang 36 Chambers, an album that was released by the Wu-Tang Clan in 1993, right? Listen, this album got 4.5 mics. This one's really tough because, again, I am a huge Wu-Tang fan. I'm a huge Wu-Tang fan. I love the solo members. I love them as a group. And I purchased just about every Wu-Tang album. This one goes from Shame on a Nigga to Clan in the Front. Can It Be So Simple? Wu-Tang Clan Ain't Nothing to Fuck With. Cream. Protect Your Neck. Oh my God. Yeah, this album This album is solid. This is a really solid 4.5 mic album. Is it 5 mics? No. It's not 5 mics. I really could do without Tears. Tears is not, it's not a whack song, but Tears is a skip for me, but it's the last song in the album, so I just let it play, right? But everything else, I mean, like, other than listening to this album in 1993 and not knowing who these people were, and it took me a minute to recognize voices and put this name with this voice, because there was no internet in 1993. But other than that, man, this is a cold ass album. I've seen some people have it as low as a 4, and that's no knock, because 4 is what? Slamming, definite satisfaction. That's what this album is. And I've seen some people have it as high as a 5. I can't give it a 5. It's not the greatest album of all time, or it's not in that discussion as the greatest album of all time. But it's a pretty damn good album. It is a pretty damn good album. Next up, 1995, The Infamous, from the group Mobb Deep. Whew, listen. This album got a lot of play in my ride in 1995. I ain't gonna lie. This one for me is extremely tough. All biases aside, this is a self-contained album. You don't have many guest features. Really and truly, there's only 2, if you're going to call that. Well, no, Ghostface. Oh, no, I take that back. There's a couple of guest features on here. Big Noyd, Ghostface, Raekwon. Big Noyd appears on 3 tracks, but Big Noyd is a part of their crew. Nas, Raekwon. So there's a couple of joints on here that has guest features. So that takes it down a peg for me. Again, if you got more than 2 guest features, that's kind of pushing it, especially for a 16-track album. That being said, this album sonically is incredible. Havoc as a producer is one of the best ever. And that's what propels this album based on the criteria that I laid out for you earlier. So where do I rank it? I think it's a 4.5 mic album. God, but it's so close. This album might be a 4 and 3 out of 4 mic album. So it's 75%. 3/4 of a mic. So it's 4 3/4. That's just how close this album is. If you say it's a classic, if you say it's a hip hop classic, if you give it 5 mics, you won't get an argument pretty much from anybody. Anybody who's listened to this album knows how cold this album is. I don't necessarily know that you could, there's in no way I could knock it down to a 4. It's definitely a 5. And if you said it's definitely a 4.5. If you said it's a 5, again, you get an argument from me. Particularly if you've heard this album. Not if you didn't hear the album, I don't really know how you could rank it, but this album, it still goes to this day. And again, I had to take my biases aside because I bought this album 3 times. I don't know why I bought it 3. Well, I know why I bought it 3 times because my thieving ass friend stole it from me twice. Shout out to Charles Thompson. So yeah, this album is definitely one of those ones. Next up, the Notorious B.I.G.'s debut album, Ready to Die. This album features songs like Gimme the Loot, Machine Gun Funk, Warning, One More Chance, the original, Juicy, Everyday Struggle, Big Papa, Unbelievable, and the cringeworthy Suicidal Thoughts. And this album is 69 minutes long. Listen, this is Biggie's debut album. I had no idea that this album was going to be this good back then. I don't think anybody did. And from the production to Biggie's lyrics, his storytelling was crazy. I don't know if I mentioned the album dropped in 1994. This album is so cold. The Source gave it 4.5 mics. There are quite a few people to this day that are mad at the Source for giving it 4.5 mics. I could make the case for this album being a 5 mic album. But I will say this. A part of why or how we look at this album still deals with the fact that Biggie is no longer with us. He was, as you know, tragically murdered in 1997. So there's a level of bias there and a level of emotion there that we can't avoid or not tap into. Because here's the thing. Biggie's posthumous second album, Life After Death, got 5 mics. And I'll be the first to tell you that is not a 5 mic album at all. It ain't even close to me. They've got some filler tracks on that, but we're not going to talk about that. But I think there was a sentiment for that for him to get 5 mics because he was murdered 2 weeks before the album came out. And I don't know when the Source reviewed the album. I don't know if it was reviewed before he passed or what have you. But nonetheless, Life After Death is, I can't make a case for Life After Death being a 5 mic album. I can make a case for this one being a 5 mic album. This is a solid, cold ass album from start to finish. I'm not a fan of Respect. I think Respect is a skip for me, but other than that, yeah, I can't touch it. I mean, I don't think you can touch it at all. So yeah, man, Biggie, it's amazing. This is an amazing album. And again, I think what happens is when we review this album, when we talk about it, we always get caught up in our feelings and our emotions and the fact that Biggie's no longer with us. But if you transport yourself to 1994, yeah, Biggie, this is this. I can't argue it being a 5 mic album. I'm gonna give it 4.5, but it's close. It might be it might be 4 3/4 like the Infamous. But yeah, it's not. I can't give it a 5, but it's about as close as you can get to being a 5. I'll tell you what, it's about time for us to pay some bills. So we're gonna take a commercial break. After the break, we'll come back and I'll give you 6 more albums so we can talk about that got 4.5 mics, and we will debate whether or not they're 5 mic albums. So sit tight. We'll be back in just a second. And just like that, we are back. Once again, I am your boy 12 Kyle, and this is an edition of the Rap Soul Podcast. Again, thank you for checking out this podcast. I really appreciate it. As I mentioned before the break, we had gone through 6 other albums. We took a look at Breaking Atoms from the Main Source, Death Certificate from Ice Cube, The Chronic from Dr. Dre, Enter the Wu-Tang 36 Chambers from Wu-Tang Clan, Ready to Die by the Notorious B.I.G., as well as The Infamous from Mobb Deep. All right, so now let's take it to, I said I'd give you 6 more albums, so let's go. All right, so the next one was released November of 1999. It is Dr. Dre's Chronic 2001. This album received 4.5 mics. I'll be honest, I was really surprised that this album received 4.5 mics because I don't really remember it getting 4.5 mics. And you know how I found out it was 4.5 mics? I opened up this particular magazine that I have. And the first review in here is Dr. Dre's Chronic 2001, where Dr. Dre did get 4.5 mics. Again, I think part of the knock that you're going to give Dr. Dre is that it's a compilation. So, you know, you're going to have a whole bunch of people on an album, any album that he does. Dr. Dre is like the rap Quincy Jones, right? He ain't doing a whole bunch of singing and rapping. He's going to kind of orchestrate everything and put everything together. And he is arguably one of the greatest, if not the greatest, hip hop producer ever. So with that being said, this album got 4.5 mics. This album is 68 minutes long. bunch of guest features, obviously, also with, Dr. Dre rapping. Like I said, it came out in 1999, in November of 1999, so right before the turn into 2000. But it got 4.5 mics. Yeah, nah, this ain't a this ain't a 4 mic. It's not a 5 mic album. From tracks like Still DRE, Explosive, What's the Difference? Forgot About Dre, Next Episode, some LA Niggas, Act Right. I mean, he's got some smokers on here. I mean, don't get it twisted. This album, sonically, there were very few like it, and that's because Dr. Dre puts his hand and his feet into his production. We already know that. That's a given, right? But I think, and I know particularly listening to this album on the second half of this album, the back half of the album, the songs just kind of play. I'll be honest. They don't really jump out at you. At least to me, they don't. I think if Dre had made this just a single CD with just, I don't know, 10, 12 tracks, it would have been fine. But there's way too many tracks on here. This album's way too long for the format in which it was presented to us. That being said, I mean, he's got some stars on here. I mean, from Snoop to the Dog Pound to Eminem, Exhibit. I mean, you can't argue with the star power. Nate Dogg, you can't argue with the star power that he has on this album. Devin the Dude, Exhibit. That being said, nah, this isn't I will make the case that this isn't a 4.5 mic album. This is the one album I would bump down to a 4. And again, 4 is slamming, definite satisfaction. I don't think that there's anything wrong with calling this album a 4. Some of you may be offended, and if you don't like it, let me know. Not that I would care, but let me know. Positive feedback. Just give me some feedback if you disagree. Yeah, I don't see it, man. 4.5 was a push for me. So if you say 5, I would honestly love to hear your opinion as to why you think this is a 5 mic album. I just don't. I mean, like, I could make a case for the Chronic. And this is not as good as the original Chronic. This is Chronic 2001. The Chronic, yes, I could make a case for it. Chronic 2, nah, I think this may have gotten a 4.5 mic album on the strength of Drake. I don't think it got a 4.5 mic album just because it was a 4.5 mic album. But like I said, I would welcome your commentary. Next up, Sex and Violence by Boogie Down Productions. KRS-One led Boogie Down Productions. This is the 5th and final album from BDP. I was surprised. This album was released in 1992. I remember I bought the tape because I was in college at South Carolina State University. Shout out to my alma mater. I bought the tape and I really liked this album. I didn't love this album. I liked it a lot though, but I didn't. And I think part of why I didn't really love the album is because, again, it was the 5th and final. Of course, I didn't know at the time it was going to be a final album from BDP, but BDP's previous albums, I loved. Like, I just was crazy about those albums. This one didn't hit as much. It was dope, and I remember playing it in my dorm room, but like, it wasn't one that I would go back to. And I went recently, probably in the last month or so, went back and heard it. This album's still dope. It's still dope as hell. 4.5 mics sounds about right. It sounds about right. It's not a 5 mic album though. It's not. I think they hit the nail on the head with this one. I don't foresee anybody. I can't say anybody because some of you may think that this is a 5 mic album, and if you do think so, please let me know. But no, I don't see it. I don't see it. 4.5 is solid. I think that's very solid. Some may say that's pushing it. I don't think so. I think you can make a case for this being a 4.5 mic album. I think you can make a case for this being a 4 mic album. I don't know that you can make a case for this being a 5 mic album. But nonetheless. Next up, Buloone Mind State from De La Soul. This album was released in 1993. Listen, this one is really, really dope. From Ego Trippin' 2 to I Be Blowin' to Break of Dawn. This is a solid album. This is a album that De La Soul made that I don't think, and with hip hop heads, I don't think it gets lost. I think where the problem comes in at is that De La Soul's previous work overshadows this album. From 3 Feet High and Rising to De La Soul Is Dead, those albums are superior to Buloone Mind State. And I think that's where, because you could make a case, and some have made the case, that De La Soul Is Dead and 3 Feet High and Rising, the 2 previous albums, are hip hop classics. You could make a case for that they are classics. Buloone Mind State isn't a classic. If you deem those 2 albums to be classics, you can't, I don't really know that you can say that this album, Buloone Mind State, is a classic. I could make a case that it's a 4.5 mic album. I will agree, based on coherence, the replayability, the lyrics, the production, just De La being De La. De La's first 3-4 album runs were crazy. That may be a future podcast episode. But nah, 5 mics, nah. I just can't do it. I can't say that this is one of the, again, it's not even their best work based on their discography. So if I can't put it at 1 or at 2 in their discography, I can't put them at a 5 mic album. But a dope album nonetheless. Next up, 1992's debut album from Redman, What the Album. Whew, listen. Again, biases aside, because this album is crazy. To me, I was in college. This album got a lot of play in my room, got a lot of play in the ride. This album just goes. And again, I really didn't know who Reggie Noble was until I bought this tape. But from songs like Time for Some Action, So Rough, Rated R, Blow Your Mind, Tonight's the Night, How to Roll a Blunt. Listen, How to Roll a Blunt taught me how to roll a blunt, and I've never smoked weed before in my life, but I can roll a blunt. Let me say that again, because I've never rolled a blunt. But How to Roll a Blunt taught me how to roll a blunt, even though I've never rolled a blunt before in my life. Superman Lover. Those songs, man. Listen, it's saying a lot for you to get 4.5 mics on your debut album. That means you've done something right. Not a lot of guest features on this album, which is cool. And it's a funky ass album with some dope ass lyrics on it. In a nutshell, that's what this album is. 4.5 for sure. I will agree. This is a 4.5 mic album. If you were to ask me if it were a 5 mic album, no, it's not. But it is close. If you say it's a 5 mic album, you get no argument from me, because this album is just that dope. It is so dope. And what I would do is I would encourage each of you, if you have not heard this album or any of these albums, matter of fact, when you finish this podcast, when you finish the other Rap Soul podcast, Go listen to these albums. They're incredible. But yeah, that's saying a lot for a debut artist because I can't. There are very few artists that come out of the gate like this by themselves, and for Reggie Noble, aka Redman, to do that says a lot about him. But crazy production, crazy lyrics. Love this album. Okay, we got two more. Next up, 1994's debut album from the rap group Outkast, Southernplayalisticadillacmuzik. Whoo. Okay, now I really have to take my biases from out of this room and take them outside and leave them like in my driveway. Because if you know me, if you've been listening to the 12 Kyle podcast, you know that I am a huge Outkast fan. Those are my guys. Literally and figuratively, those are my guys. Big Boy famously said, I gotta hit the source. I need my other half a mic because that Southern Playalistic Cadillac music was a classic, right? Close quote. Big. It's not. It's not. But the lyrics, the production from Organized Noise, it's there. I mean, from Ain't No Thing to Southern Playalistic Cadillac Music, Players Ball, Get Up, Get Out, Crumbling Herb, Players Ball Reprise, Hootie Hoo. Man, not a lot of guest features. It's just Goody Mob. That's it. And their family. Album's right at an hour and 4 minutes. Listen, I would say it's 4.5. If you say it's a 4 mic album, I would argue with you because I don't think it's a 4 mic album. I think it's just that good. If you say it's a 5 mic album, I could probably push back on that because Funky Ride is. They didn't need Funky Ride on here. Deep is not needed either, and that's a 5-minute track. And Funky Ride's Deep is a 5.5 minute track, and Funky Ride is a 6.5 minute track. So if you take those two tracks off, you got an album that's damn near under 50 minutes, which is perfect. But yeah, man, this is one of those ones that like I've never stopped playing this album ever. Again, I'm a huge Outkast fan, so I have to leave my biases aside. But no, this is not a 5 mic album. If you say that it is, tell me why. I'm all ears. And last but not least, 1995, The Purple Tape. And the reason why we call it The Purple Tape is because when the tape came out, the tape really and truly was purple. If you bought the CD, the CD truly was purple. That would be none other than the debut solo album from Ghostface Killah why did I say Ghostface Killah? From Raekwon featuring Ghostface Killah, called Only Built for Cuban Linx. Sorry about that. Get a little ahead of myself here. I'm sorry. I'm excited. It's the first episode, right? This album, crazy. Lyrics from criminology to incarcerated Scarfaces. Can It All Be So Simple? Remix. The Shark Biters skit. Glaciers of Ice. Verbal Intercourse with Ghostface and Nas. Ice Cream. Listen, man, you talk about crazy album from start to finish. Nah, it's close. It's not 5 mics. if you told me you give it 5 mics, I'd be interested to listen. I'm definitely down to listen as to why you would give it 5 mics. And who knows? Maybe if you tell me why you would give it 5 mics, you could turn my arm a little bit, and I might change my mind. Heaven and Hell could go. That's the last song on the album. That song could go. Other than that, there's not really any songs I would get rid of on this album. So this one's close. This one's really, really close. Not a lot of guest features. The guest features are pretty much just crew. The other Wu-Tang members, as well as you get a guest feature really from Nas. But outside of Nas, everybody else is Wu family. So, I don't know, man. I don't know. There's no way I could argue if you told me that this was a 5 mic album. I can't even figure out why. I'd have to sit down and think of reasons why this wouldn't be a 5 mic album. I don't make it a 5 mic album. For one, I'm extremely biased when it comes to this album. But two, like I said, Heaven and Hell that's all that need to be on this album. Other than that, Heaven and Hell probably, Heaven and Hell may be the only thing that keeps this away from being 5 mics. Is it groundbreaking? The sound, but they introduced the Wu Gambinos. It's just different, man. It's not one of the greatest albums of all time, in my opinion, but it's up there. It's up there. If you say, if you go with, which we're not going to do, but if you go with the original 15 albums that were 5 mic albums and say those are the greatest, then let's say those are 1 through 15, then there's a slot from like 15 and 20. That album's going to fall somewhere around here. It is just that good. But yeah, man, that's tough. That is so tough. But there you have it. That is it. Again, I wanted to talk about these albums because these albums were deemed almost classic. Breaking Atoms, Main Source, Death Certificate, Ice Cube, The Chronic, Dr. Dre, Enter the Wu-Tang 36 Chambers, Wu-Tang Clan, Ready to Die, The Notorious B.I.G., The Infamous by Mobb Deep, Chronic 2001, Dr. Dre, Sex and Violence, Boogie Down Productions, Buloone Mindstate, De La Soul, What, The Album, Redman, Southernplayalisticadillacmuzik, Outkast, and last but not least, Only Built for Cuban Linx, Raekwon the Chef, featuring Ghostface Killah. This is tough. In conclusion, this was tough because, again, I'm a huge hip hop head. That's one of the things that you will come to know about me as you listen to this podcast. I'm a huge hip hop head. I love hip hop. And I think the hip hop that spans the music that came in this particular time and these albums that I talked about on this podcast, I think was a great amount of time. But don't just listen to me. Like I said, do yourself a favor after you hear these episodes, go back and listen to some of these albums. I think you will find that, not only were these albums really, really good, but they really set the bar for how a lot of hip hop albums would sound in the years coming forward. Because these albums span from 1991 to 2000. No, I don't think we did one from 2000. I think it's from 1991 to 1999. So yeah, do that and definitely let me know what you think. And I want to thank you all for checking out this edition of the Rap Soul Podcast. And that's going to do it for me. Again, thanks again for listening to the Rap Soul Podcast. A couple of things. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast. The podcast is on all streaming platforms. If you can't find one, you've listened this long, you listened to it on something. So wherever you are, subscribe right there. There's a link tree in the description in the show notes. You can just subscribe there as well. Very important. If you would like to continue this discussion, go to our Reddit page, the Rap Soul Podcast on Reddit. Go in there and keep this conversation going. If you think that the ratings are correct, I'd like to hear from you. If you think that they're incorrect, I'd like to hear from you as well. I'd love to hear your feedback. One thing I will say, though, when it comes to Reddit, I welcome all opinions. Opinions are golden. Disrespect is not. Please respect yourself and others as you make your comments. This ain't the place for wild comments, cussing and talking about people and all kind of stuff like that. Let's keep it G. Let's keep it positive. Okay. But I do welcome your feedback also on YouTube. You can subscribe there and watch there as well. You can also comment on Spotify if you listen there as well. Keep in mind that since this is the first episode of the Rap Soul podcast, we decided to give you 2 other episodes as well. So besides this one, you've got 2 more episodes to listen to before we come back next Monday with a brand new episode. So if you've liked what you've heard so far, go listen to the other 2 podcasts and let me know what you think. If you're on Twitter, X, IG, Facebook, Threads, and TikTok, follow us there, the Rap Soul Podcast. Again, that's going to do it for me. I am your boy 12 Kyle. We'll catch you guys next time. 5 Gs.
Thank you for listening. This concludes the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the Rap Soul Podcast. You can find the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Follow the podcast on social media. And feel free to continue this discussion on our Reddit page. More importantly, share this podcast with a friend or family member who loves music as much as you do. Until next time, 5,000.